I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come and share some thoughts about this topic with you. I want to thank Sandy Olson and the organizers of this meeting for providing me this opportunity to talk about something that I think is certainly something that we should be worried about as we serve communities, particularly growing diverse communities. That this is an issue that affects particularly the Latino community, but it also affects the Asian American community, and it affects those of us that may not necessarily be of immigrant background, because many of these young adults are our friends, our confidants. They are people that we deeply care about, and we want to see them do well. We want to have them enjoy the same kinds of privileges that is guaranteed by American society and by our system of democracy. But given current immigration laws, there are certain things that children and young adults who are undocumented are not able to fully enjoy. So just to give you a brief overview about what are we talking about here in terms of how many young adults and children are affected by this. The latest estimates, and as you can imagine, this is a very difficult population to pinpoint because they don't want to be identified. They worry about being identified. But the best estimates that we have is that there are about 3.2 million children and young adults under the age of 24 who are undocumented. Roughly about half of those are currently enrolled in the K-12 school system, and about the other half are either high school graduates or didn't graduate high school, but that are in that age of between 18 and 24. And we estimate that every year, about 65,000, estimates are as high as 80,000 with some studies, graduate every year from American high schools. And so when they graduate, when they reach that critical transition point, they face a variety of challenges. Because of their undocumented status, they're not eligible for federal and state financial aid, with the exception of 2 states, and Texas is one of them. They're also, they can't work. They don't have a social security number, so they can't go and apply for a job and make a living. In most states, they're treated as international students, which means that even though they may have graduated from a state school, a state high school, if they want to go to college, they have to pay tuition rates oftentimes that can be as high as 10 times what in-state residents have to pay. Again, Texas was the first state in the nation to provide in-state tuition so that graduates from Texas high schools can enroll in public colleges and universities and pay the same tuition rates that U.S.-born or citizen residents that are also graduates of Texas high schools pay. And of course, something that is a permanent concern for undocumented children and young adults and individuals in general is the concern about being deported at any time. And certainly that is something that has been heightened in the last few years, given that under the current administration, deportations and workplace raids have increased to the highest levels, compared to previous administrations. So this is something also, though, that impacts U.S.-born children, the issue of the undocumented population. The best estimate as of now is that there's about 11.5 million overall. This is all children, young adults, and adults who live in this country without legal status. And about 6 million children that are U.S. born are born to parents that are undocumented. So they're in a unique situation because they also worry about deportation in many ways that are similar to these children and young adults who themselves are undocumented. And that is because they worry that they may come home and their parents are not going to be there because they're being deported. And this is certainly happening more and more throughout the country. Recently, a few months ago, I was in Iowa, it's a state that has experienced some of the largest workplace rates in the country. And many folks share with me that a lot of the local farming towns, a lot of immigrant communities are growing in the Midwest because of the demand for agricultural labor. And so a lot of these communities, close to 50% of children have parents who are undocumented. And so when these big raids happen, and actually some of the biggest single-day raids in the U.S. history, that all of a sudden schools and community members have to worry about making sure that children have an adult to take care of them because their parents have been taken away. And several folks share that with me in Iowa, that the community had to come together to make sure that the children were okay. So clearly, I mean, this is a system that I think regardless of where you may be on the political spectrum, everyone agrees that our current immigration system and our laws are ineffective. And so there's a disconnect between what the current laws allow and provide in terms of providing a path to legalization and the growing number of individuals who face this uncertain future in life. One of the primary legal protections for undocumented children is a Supreme Court case known as Plyler Doe. And this is a Supreme Court case where in 1982, in a ruling that actually took 7 years to get to the Supreme Court, starting in 1975, here in the state of Texas, there were several school districts that actually tried to ban undocumented children from enrolling in public schools. Well, those policies were challenged in the courts, and 7 years later, they reached the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1982, the Supreme Court ruled that it was, in fact, unconstitutional to deny educational access to children based on their legal status. And citing the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the Supreme Court argued that it was, in fact, in the compelling interest of the state to educate undocumented children, because the state had no way of knowing whether in the future they would have a path to legalization. And so by denying them access to education, that it would create a disabling condition for them, that they wouldn't be able to fully become integrated into American society if they did not have access to education. That Supreme Court stands today, several decades later, and so as a result of that, we have children who go through the school system, the state invests in their education, but the states are not able to get a return on that investment in the way that they can with other children because of current federal laws on immigration. And so that's really sort of the sets of conditions that in many ways have shaped the experiences of these children and young adults who grow up undocumented. So how much does it impact educational access, higher education access for these young adults if they're undocumented compared to those that are not undocumented? So this is a table here that you see up here that was in a report that was put out by the Pew Hispanic Center out of DC in 2009. And I want to bring your attention to the top two bars there that were the unauthorized immigrants and legal immigrants. So this is a number that provides the percentages of young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 that are either high school dropouts, have had some college or a high school degree. And you see there that for young adults who have legal status, who are of immigrant background, only 15% are high school dropouts. But for those that are undocumented or the same age range, between 18 and 24, that rate is 40%. So it's more than double that rate for those that are high school dropouts. If you look at the other side of that graph, the percentage of these young adults who have at least some college education or a college degree. If you're an immigrant young adult that has legal status, 60% of those between the ages of 18 and 24 have at least some college experience. For those that don't have legal status, that percentage is less than half of that. It's only 26%. And then you can see how that compares to US-born children in terms of higher education access. So what this chart sort of illustrates is that the impact in terms of higher education access is quite dramatic, right? That it really does structure sort of these pathways that are available or not for these young adults based on their legal status. So, you know, I've been doing this kind of work for the last 5 years, and we did this national survey of undocumented students because there is virtually no research on the topic, and I came to learn about this in quite a heartbreaking way. Back in 2006, I and a couple of my graduate students decided that we were going to do some volunteer work in the community, so we went through this program called Cash for College that we have in California, and it's a program to encourage working class, low-income youth to go to college. You know, the research consistently finds that for children growing up in poverty or working class or who are potentially the first in their family to go to college, that one of the biggest barriers is the lack of information about financial aid. Many of these children and young adults think that college is only for rich people, or it's only for people that have, you know, lots of financial resources. It's a great misconception among the community. And so, you know, this program, you know, sort of attempts to dispel some of these misconceptions about financial aid. And so what they do is they train volunteers to do these workshops in community centers and high schools. So we were doing these workshops, and at the end of every workshop, you know, I do a sort of a little 15 to 20-minute blur and then some Q&A. And at the end of those sessions, there was always a handful of students that would kind of linger around until everybody left, and then sort of sheepishly make their way up to the front and worked up the courage to ask, you know, are these resources available to me? I'm undocumented, you know, or I don't have my papers. And, you know, the first time it happened, I thought, you know, this is tragic. Let me look into it. Let me see what I can do for you. But each time that I did a workshop in a different community, in a different school, it was, you know, sometimes even a larger group. Sometimes even it was half of the students, you know, who had these challenges. So I decided at that point to contribute to this national discourse about immigration, particularly as it relates for young adults, and began a research program that continues to today. So here, I want to sort of just give you a snapshot of sort of what are some of the background characteristics of these students. What I want to highlight here is, you know, oftentimes in the national discourse about immigration, the discourse is structured around sort of this binary. And in my interpretation, it's a false binary, that it's an issue that it's either right or wrong, that it's sort of framed as legal and illegal, lawbreaker or not. And that way of structuring the conversation, I think, misses a lot of the nuances and complexities of the issue that prevent us from really understanding, you know, what we're essentially talking about here. And essentially, we're talking about children and young adults who grew up American. If you see here, these are the average age of the students that I interviewed and surveyed. And they range from high school seniors all the way to graduates. Young adults who, against all odds, were able to graduate from college, had a college degree in hand, but yet were not able to, fully apply those skills and that training that they received through higher education. And so you see here the ages range between 18 and 24, 25 of the individuals that we surveyed. But what I want to bring your attention to is this, the next line that says immigration age. This is the average age that the students were when they first came to the US. So what this shows, if you subtract the average age that they came here from their age at the time of the survey, you will quickly come to the conclusion that most of these children and young adults' lives have in fact been spent here in the US. That their sense of themselves how they think about the world, have been almost completely shaped by American society. Their identity is connected inextricably to our way of life. And so they came here before schooling age. So, you know, all of their formative years were here. And so, and you see here that also a characteristic of undocumented students, and I think that's important to sort of acknowledge, is that they come from families with very low income backgrounds. Parents and families and households that live at or below you know, poverty levels. And you see here that parents' average level of education, these are the average number of years. And you see there that the average number of years of education is less than the high school education. Parents have slightly higher average levels of education, about 10th or 11th grade education. So these are children who don't have college-educated parents as a resource at home. And, you know, plenty of research has documented what an important resource it is when you as a young adult have a parent that has gone through college and can transmit that information onto you. These are students who, you know, do quite well in school. There's variability, but these are students that are diligent, and I'll talk a little bit about why we see that. This is something that is not unique to undocumented students, and in fact is unique to immigrant children in general. But something else that I want to bring your attention to here on this table is the last two rows that shows the number of hours that they worked during high school and in college. Because these are children and young adults who grow up in low-income, very low-income families, they oftentimes also have to work to support the family, right? When they get to college, they have to do that, and on top of that, they also have to save up money to pay for their own tuition, because oftentimes they don't qualify for, they don't qualify for scholarships or anything like that, so they have to pay for everything, but they still have to help the parents, because, sort of this collectivist orientation. And so these are sort of, if you start to think of all the layers, right? So, you saw on the previous slide that, they worry about deportation, they can do these things, but there's also the layers of sort of living in low-income households, and sort of all of the challenges that I'm sure you're familiar with that are associated with a variety of social negative outcomes. And so this is sort of a snapshot then of the background of undocumented students, particularly those that are college-bound. Now, something else that was quite a surprise to us is that these are students that also in various ways, and again, just to demonstrate how interconnected they are to American society, that they're very much involved in school. Just like, your average, typical American high school or college student, they're involved, much like the young adults that you heard about, the different organizations and activities that they participate in. Many of them that we surveyed were, in fact, the prom king and queen and homecoming king and queen and class presidents and all of that. And so here, this table shows their levels of civic engagement. So civic engagement are things like community service and volunteer work. And in fact, we found very high levels of that. Something that was particularly striking, and I think particularly here in the state of Texas, has become sort of a way to become empowered for young adults, is the growing activism that they're engaged in. And this table here shows that if you look at high schools and you go down the line to college students and graduates, that the percentage of those that are engaged in some form of activism increases. And part of the reason, there's several reasons for that, but part of the reason is sort of this growing frustration that for many of them, they don't even know that they're undocumented until when they start to prepare for that transition into adulthood. And for many, that is a transition to college, right? Or maybe, going into other things after high school. And it is at that point, for many of them, that this shocking news sort of emerges. Many times their parents, don't share that with them because they want to protect them from sort of the disappointment and all the things associated with finding out that all of a sudden things are going to be different for you, that they're not going to be just like your best friend who was born here and is going to be able to go to college and be eligible for financial aid. That was a scenario that was quite common for undocumented students. You know, their best friends are U.S. citizens, and they are getting ready to go to college, but they don't have those same options. So this table here, what it shows is that these are students that have been civically engaged since elementary school. And part of the reason is because schools increasingly structure this, these kinds of activities. They provide opportunities for students to become involved. And so what that does is that it further ingrains and shapes their notion of, their sense of belonging in American society. So you can imagine that they grow up thinking of themselves as American and nothing else, and they reach a certain point where all of that is shattered. For lack of better words, it is a pretty significant moment for them when they find out that they're undocumented. And in the interviews, I was able to interview over 100 young adults who are undocumented, and many of them describe how they were stellar students, above 4.0, 3.8, 3.9. And they find out that they're undocumented and their grades just plummet because, for them the hopelessness is too much to bear. And so you see here that, in fact, throughout their schooling, beginning in elementary school, they take on leadership roles as students, and they are civically engaged. They begin to do community service. Many of them, for example, in elementary describe tutoring and working with younger children as one of the primary activities that they did in elementary school. So a question that I think for many of you that it would be relevant for the work that you do is this question of, is undocumented status related to mental health outcomes? And should we, as we strive to better serve diverse communities, should we take into consideration documentation status in the assessment of psychological and emotional well-being? And so I'm going to provide some findings for you and some highlights from some of the work that we've done over the years that certainly strongly suggests that this would be a useful approach in serving diverse communities. And so to give you a context, particularly as the community that is affected by this most directly is the immigrant community, so children who grow up in immigrant families. And so just to sort of give you a sense of what we know about what the experience is of undocumented or of immigrant individuals, is that whereas for most of us, we have sort of these 5 primary sources of stress. So for all of us, our stress levels varies based on sort of these things that happen in these 5 dimensions that you see at the bottom part of this figure here. Okay, so typical sources of stress for all of us are health, family, work or school, financial or environmental concerns, right? Those are the things that are primary stressors. When you're an immigrant, there are additional sources of stress. So what that means is that if there are potentially additional sources of stress, that the likelihood of experiencing stress is higher. Doesn't mean that it's actually going to turn out that way, but there's a greater potential. And it certainly is the case for immigrant children and young adults. And so this is a model that has been informed by several decades of research looking at the mental health and well-being of immigrant individuals. And so for immigrants, there's sort of these 3 additional sources. One of them is sort of immigration status, right? And the culture shock of having to adapt to a new culture, a new language. And for children who grow up here, so you saw these undocumented children, they grew up here for most of their lives, but their parents didn't, right? And so that, so they're acculturating, they're assimilating into American society at a much faster rate than their parents. And so that creates sort of this greater cultural distance, if you will, between parent and child, and that can create a variety of challenges in immigrant families. And that is a source of stress. So this acculturation and cultural change is a source of stress. And also, of course, minority status. I mean, for being a member of an ethnically minority group in the United States has a lot of social challenges associated with it. And I'll show you some data that kind of speaks to that in a little bit. So, in the academic literature, there's very little research yet. There's a growing body of research, but there's still, compared to sort of other areas, there's still much that we need to learn about sort of the well-being of undocumented adolescents. But from what we know, some of the research, for example, cites sort of these experiences, particularly for children that grow up near the border region, of sort of harassment by law enforcement officials, and certainly it's something that I would imagine has increased dramatically in the state of Arizona, where there are sort of those concerns are particularly salient for families. So that's something that's been cited, sort of this sense of imprisonment and paranoia. If you continue to have these experiences, then that's going to sort of shape the way that you think about your sense of safety. And so we know that these challenges are in fact a central part of the immigrant experience for these children and young adults. Something that they experience as well is for immigrant families, many of them, remember, they're low income and they're living at or below the poverty line. So when they make the journey to the U.S., they're not able to make that journey together as a family unit. And so family separation, in fact, is quite common. And the vast majority, a lot of research sort of documents this, experience separation of several years, between them and their parents. And so, of course, that can create some parent bonding challenges when, you haven't seen your mother or your father for 4 or 5 years, and then you're reunited. That can create some challenges, particularly a sense of resentment that may be, in the child because they feel abandoned by the parent. And that's something that has been noted in the research literature. And of course, that process of coming to the U.S., many of them, in fact, experience a dramatic event, something that, it's quite shocking and can, in fact, cause post-traumatic stress disorder, which is something that is also true of adult immigrants. And so once they get here, so there's this anxiety associated with this concern of risk. It's something that has been documented in the academic research literature. So researchers sort of have gone out and looked at this and do in fact find consistently that this is something that they worry about, particularly among what is known as mixed status families. So what mixed status families are families where some members have legal status and others do not. So some of them may be just siblings who were born in the U.S. after the family immigrated, so they have legal status, or some that were able to get legal status, and because of the convoluted immigration laws, others have not been able to do that. And so in those families, the high level of anxiety is salient, because members worry about some people potentially being taken away, and others being left alone. And so in the college student population, those that are between these ages of 18 and 24, these emerging studies that are looking at undocumented students in higher education, again, sort of consistently find this same theme, that they feel lonely, depression, frustration, helplessness, shame, and an ongoing sense of isolation. So these next couple of charts that I'm going to show you just sort of kind of give you a visual representation of just how, as they get older, undocumented young adults and late adolescents, the distress that they experience sort of just continues to escalate. So here, you see this graph comparing undocumented high school, college students and college graduates and those that have legal status. We also surveyed a group of young adults who lived most of their life undocumented but had been able to legalize their status, because one of the things that I was particularly interested in understanding is to inform policy. So I wanted to see, well, now that these young adults have been able to legalize their status, what are they doing? How are they contributing to American society? And is that a piece of information that could be helpful to us in this national discourse about the merits of providing a path to legalization? So we wanted to speak to that, and so we collected some data on individuals that, in fact, at the time of the survey and the interview, had legal status. And if you compare the level of distress, and so we use sort of the survey instruments to measure distress, you see there that among the undocumented groups, that high school students are the lowest, but as students get older, that level of distress continues to go up. And that those levels of distress, in fact, are higher than those young adults who have legal status. So clearly, the level of distress varies between those that have legal status and those that do not. And the older that you get, you experience greater frustrations, greater barriers and obstacles, and that's going to stress you out. Also, you see here, we asked them about their experiences with prejudice and discrimination. This is something that has been noted in the research literature that looks at the social experience of ethnic minority individuals in American society. And you see here again that there is sort of an increase. As students get older, they report greater levels of prejudice and discrimination. And what's really interesting here is that even for those that are documented, those that have legal status, even they report prejudice and discrimination that's related to their ethnic background, right? So, so certainly here, the sense of discrimination, the stress levels, they increase as students get older and they face additional challenges and barriers. So here, sort of just another way to look at that, at the distress between those college students that have legal status and those that don't have legal status, and college graduates that have legal status versus those that don't. And you see here clearly significant differences between, if you have legal status, your distress is much lower, if you're a college graduate or a college student, than those that don't have legal status. So there, I mean, that's just another way to see the difference between how legal status, in fact, matters in terms of the distress, and also experiences of discrimination is very high for college graduates. They are significantly higher than the other groups that you see here. So what I want to do is sort of give you a sense from the over 100 interviews that I did with young adults, in their own words, to sort of describe to you what that distress feels like. And I've also, one of the things that we've done over the years, we've interviewed a lot of community members that work directly with young adults who are undocumented. So these are folks like teachers and counselors, both the high school level and at the community college. So here I pulled some quotes from undocumented young adults, and also from educational professionals who have worked with them and have seen some of these experiences and frustrations that they've expressed. So this is a quote from Jacinto, who talks about his sense of shame and fear, and he says, "It shouldn't be, but I'm ashamed. I'm not like everyone else. I don't have an ID and I don't have a driver's license. If someone asked for an ID, I had to take out a passport, and especially now with all the immigration debates, I really don't want to speak out." And this was a constant theme across all of the interviews, that the sense of shame that they carry with them. Here's another quote from Esperanza, who says, "I get scared of applying for scholarships. I still haven't done my internship in broadcasting because I'm scared that when I go to a radio station, they might ask me for a social security card. I do get depressed and I get disappointed that I'm doing all this work, and for me to graduate and not be able to work in the field that I want, instead I have to get another job instead of a job that I love." So whereas in American society, one of the driving forces, one of the things that motivates all of us is this sense of our ideology that sort of defines us, as a nation, is that if you work hard enough, that you will reap the rewards. That this is a country, unlike other countries, that if you put in the work, you will get that return of that investment that you made. for undocumented students, that ideal doesn't apply for them. Right? And so they grow up in schools hearing about this ideal that, look, if you work hard enough, there are opportunities for you, and you'll be able to get as far as you can based on your own skills and assets. And so students, they begin to internalize that. They're very much driven by that. And a lot of the research literature shows that immigrants in particular are sort of hyper-American in that sense, that whereas we embrace that notion of the American dream, for immigrants, it's about 10 times as high, right? I mean, one of the reasons why they come to the U.S. from all over the world is precisely in pursuit of the American dream. And, and so it wasn't very difficult for me to pick the title of the book because it was such a central part of the narrative of these young adults. That title came directly from the interviews that I did, and my publisher and I were kind of racking our heads about coming up with a clever, catchy title. And then one morning I just woke up and it just came to me. I had been reviewing the interviews the night before, and I said, this is it, because this is the thing that I remember the most. I got up in the morning, the thing that kind of I remember about the analyzing the transcripts was the American dream, and we are Americans. Why can't people see that, right? And so for this young woman, that sense of disappointment that, this American dream that was promised to her doesn't apply was quite difficult to deal with. Here's Carla also expressing a similar sentiment. She says, the uncertainty that you have, you kind of want to stick to looking at things moment by moment, because if you look too far ahead, sometimes it gets you depressed. I don't know what's going to happen, right? And so that's a permanent sort of sense for them to feel this, I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know what to work to. It's very difficult for them to be motivated to work towards something if they don't even know if that's going to become possible for them. So, the educational professionals that we talked to pretty much echoed a lot of what the students said. And so here's a perspective from Rick. These are all pseudonyms, who was an academic affairs professional at a community college. And he says, and again, this is sort of his sense about students that he works with. He says, there's a lot of either shame or guilt in using services because of how other people view them is how they've internalized viewing themselves. That they shouldn't even be getting any services because they're undocumented and have no right to these kinds of services. This is another perspective from Linda, where she says, in most cases, I feel like they feel alone and they feel like there's no one that can help them. Even though I say I'm here to be your advocate, or I want to help you, or I want to see you succeed, they still feel like, that's great, but you can't help me because nobody can help me. Right? So I would say loneliness is huge, lack of support, and then hopelessness. This is something that, and most of the professionals and the educators that we spoke to, had a similar observation. John, who was an academic counselor at a community college, said, they are fearful that they can't trust anyone or that anyone can understand them. I'm sure that it can go as deep as students being depressed. They're also dealing with the law, and this is a constant fear. Am I going to be deported? Do I have to worry about my family being deported? They don't feel permanent. Any day it's possible that things can change. Dennis, who does a lot of outreach to high schools for the community college that he worked for, he says, a lot of students feel that they do not belong just because of their status. Also, they're a little apprehensive and afraid to disclose their status to others. Some of the parents are afraid that if their students go to school, somehow they will find out that they do not have documents. Now, one of the challenges for mental health professionals in helping undocumented students with dealing with some of the symptoms that you see here is that lack of trust. Right? They don't know if they can share that with you. I mean, so imagine having, a concern, but you are worried about divulging that concern because you think that might not only put your life in jeopardy, but your family's life in jeopardy. So that is a pretty significant barrier, I think, for those of us in the mental health profession to provide services and assistance. And so I'll have some thoughts about how to get around that in a few minutes. And so John talks about sort of the sense of discrimination that students feel, and he says they're dealing with racism. Hearing their professors talking about supporting the bill in Arizona or being against illegal immigration, It might not necessarily be specifically directed at them. The teacher's not necessarily sitting in front of them saying you, but making general statements on a daily basis where they have to deal with racism in their face. So this is, again, when students are struggling to reach out for help, right? But then in their school environments, they're hearing people sort of who, are making negative comments about, quote unquote, illegal immigrants. That's going to make them even more apprehensive. So there's already the concern about safety, but then when they hear those things, that's going to make them even sort of, kind of clamp up even more. And that's a challenge because, as over the years, I've met young adults that certainly need, professional assistance from a mental health counselor to manage some of these feelings and concerns that they have. And so here's, there was, for the students, there was a lot of direct actual experiences where somebody just said, something that was very discriminatory. So Irene is the last example that I have here, that she says, there was one time when I told a counselor that was AB 540. AB 540 is a law in California that provides in-state tuition to undocumented students. Now, most of the students, by the way, that we interviewed and surveyed were primarily from Texas and California. This is a young woman that was in California. So AB 540 is the in-state tuition law in California. And so a lot of students, because there's less stigma associated with the term AB 540 in California, undocumented students will use that term instead of undocumented. They'll say, I'm an AB 540 student. There's actually some people have written about sort of the usefulness, that identity of AB 540, that it's easier to actually seek help if you self-identify as AB 540 as opposed to undocumented. So Irene says, so I told the counselor that was AB 540, and then he asked, oh, what's that? So I started to explain, and then he says, does that exist? I said, yeah. So then he says, you're an immigrant. That's what it is, right? And I replied, yeah, but mainly it's a law that was passed. Then he says, you still can't make it in life, so why do you bother? So there's two things here that I want to highlight. And this isn't an isolated incident. There were quite, in fact, many like that. And in the book, across the stories that are profiled, you'll hear some examples of this. But there's sort of two issues that I want to highlight with this quote. One is that one of the consistent findings is, even though we have 11 states now, and it looks like by the end of the month we might have 12, the Maryland legislature has just approved an in-state tuition bill that is waiting a governor's approval, and the governor has already said that that law will be signed. Even though there are 11 states that provide in-state tuition, and then there are 2 states that provide state funds to provide scholarships, most educators are unaware of those laws. They don't know anything about them, right? And so when students come and say that they're undocumented, they tell them basically there's nothing for you. Sorry, I'm sorry, and that's a problem, So this lack of awareness on the part of educators and professionals who work with students. But the other one is sort of this anti-immigrant sentiment, that there are in fact many folks who work in these areas who sort of have this attitude, and that's a challenge for students because they deal with them directly when they're looking for services. And so so you've heard about these layers associated with being undocumented and the stress and depression. But I want to remind you that that's not the only layer. That there's sort of the layer of being from a low socioeconomic background. And so here Gail talks about sort of when you start to add all of these stressors, that they really take a toll on students and how they're able to fully invest in their educational endeavors. And she says students who are AB 540 who don't qualify for work study, they have to work the late night graveyard shift while at the same time trying to keep their grades up, which is hard. I've seen students fall asleep during the class because they had to work all night and then come to school in the mornings. So, one of the more impressive things that despite all of these things that I just shared with you and all the challenges that these individuals face, that they have this resilience about them. And I think that, one way to look at that is that that's an opportunity for mental health professionals to tap into that, to help students fully realize their potential or to encourage them, while as a nation we work on comprehensive immigration reform. That there is this resource, the psychosocial resource within these students that we can tap into to ensure that they don't go down a negative path where they'll engage in sort of some of the problematic behavior that is going to take them on the wrong path. So one of the things that was impressive to me was that 70% of the students that we surveyed and interviewed identified these 5 professions as something that they aspired for. And what was even more impressive is a sense of commitment to their communities, because they wanted to be doctors not because it was prestigious or because they thought they were going to make a lot of money. They wanted to be doctors because they saw the lack of access to healthcare in their communities, and so that was one of the rationales why they wanted to do that. Same thing with law. They wanted to go into immigration law or civil rights law to work on some of the issues that had directly impacted them. They wanted to be college professors or educators because in their educational experiences, much like we heard the young adults in the panel earlier, that these were the folks that were critical in providing encouragement, in providing a sense of possibility for them. And so they had been so pivotal in their lives that they aspired to be like them. And so many of them said that they wanted to be community college professors. Many of them go through the community college because it's more affordable for them. That they wanted to be community college professors because there was a professor who reached out and said, you're brilliant, you're great, and I'm going to help you. Or they wanted to go into civil service. So these are things like social workers, mental health professionals, police officers, firefighters. And so, all of these are sort of service professions. These are professions oftentimes where we have a shortage of individuals to go in some of these professions, particularly in California in terms of, math teachers and things like that. Until we have legislation in place to address sort of this, this challenges of legal status for young adults, the research literature on adult undocumented immigrants is not very encouraging. And so the bullet points here that I have note that there is certainly a lot more research, mental health research on undocumented adults than there is on young adults or children. And all of the literature on undocumented adults says that there's all of these negative mental health outcomes associated with being an undocumented adult, right? And so the kinds of things that we're starting to see with young adults, and you saw sort of the progression as they get older, well, that sort of maps onto what the research literature says about adults. So this is the kind of future that unless we, change sort of these kind of legal conditions for these young adults, these are the kinds of challenges, these are the kinds of mental health outcomes that we can expect. So the ongoing fear of deportation and concerns about employment and health, and sort of this lack of contact with families and friends. They can't go back, like many immigrant families from Mexico. Many of them, it's sort of, during the summers, they keep that sense of connectedness because they're able to go back and forth, especially for those that come from near the border region. That's not an option for undocumented children and young adults. And so that's something that is in their future because of their legal status. And so, so the sense of distress and depression is going to continue to increase, and that's what the research literature says. So the way that I've characterized this issue in my work, and the way that I want to sort of propose that we think about the experiences of these young adults who grew up American, is that unless we do something about their situation, it really is translating, that lack of action is translating into a loss of talent. Right? And because these are folks that are fully capable to do all kinds of amazing things. And they've shown great promise, but we know that promise isn't enough, that there has to be conditions that facilitate sort of that promise to develop into something that further contributes to benefit all of society. And so these are students that are quite capable, but are not able to fully realize that potential and contribute to American society. So just to give you a snapshot of what would it mean if we actually provided a path to legalization for these young adults. And so going back to the interviews and surveys that we did with young adults that had been able to legalize their status, here's just sort of a sampling of the kinds of things that they're doing now that they have legal status. So you see all of them have college degrees. Most of them have advanced degrees. You see there are a couple of lawyers, college professors, a couple of social workers, engineering students. These are folks that are certainly contributing to American society in a variety of ways, not just in an economic sense, but also in a civic sense, in terms of the leadership that they provide for their communities. And so that's, I've compared sort of these two different groups. They're very similar if you look at sort of what age they came and parent demographics. These are also folks that come from low-income families where the levels of education is less than high school. They also had to work long hours when they were in high school and college. Not as much as in college because some of them were able to legalize their status in college, so they were eligible for financial aid at that time. But in terms of the demographic profile, they're almost identical to the undocumented students that I share with you in the earlier slides. And so that's where I think, I propose that we consider that in our discussions about policy changes at the federal, state, and even local levels. And I'm going to briefly, the biggest, I think, vehicle for providing a path to legalization for undocumented students has been the DREAM Act. And unfortunately, the DREAM Act was closely defeated in Congress in December. It fell just 5 votes short in the Senate. It passed in the House of Representatives. There's discussion now to reintroduce it this year, this legislative session. But that's really the piece of legislation. States are not able to regulate immigration. That's the federal government's job. And so that's really the promise that undocumented students are waiting for, a promise that for many of them they've been waiting for since 2001 when it was first introduced. So it's been about 10 years. And as I mentioned earlier, there are now 11 states, soon to be 12, that provide in-state tuition. New Mexico and Texas also provide in-state funds for students to use for higher education. California has reintroduced again legislation that would make it the third state to provide in-state tuition. So has New York. Oregon and Connecticut and Rhode Island are on their way as well in providing in-state tuition. So by the end of the year, potentially, we could see this number go from 12 to about 15. And there are pending legislation that is going to be introduced in Missouri and in Colorado. So in the states where about roughly 80 to 90% of the undocumented population reside, these states have recognized that there is a need to support these promising young adults. And they've done it in the only way that they can given the constraints on immigration policy by providing in-state tuition and assistance from state funds. Private colleges and universities that have much more flexibility and don't have to deal with a lot of sort of the legal challenges due to federal law are now providing full scholarships. So here's a partial list. Most of the Ivy League schools now provide full scholarships. So think about a moment of what that means. So Harvard University, for example, where the cost of tuition with living expenses and everything is $60,000 a year. So universities like Harvard are investing $60,000 a year for 4 years to educate promising undocumented students to get accepted. There was an article a few months ago at the beginning of the school year that at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a story in the front page of the newspaper that in the freshman incoming class at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the Ivy League schools, there were 17 undocumented students as part of the incoming class. In my alma mater, Pomona College, which is also a private liberal arts school, there were 13 undocumented students in the incoming class. So increasingly, private universities, there's a growing number of them that provide these full scholarships. But again, without federal law, there isn't much that these students can do with that college degree. And so there's now a growing number of college graduates, many of them that come from Harvard. I've met many of them. In a few weeks, I will be meeting some in a visit to Boston who have a college degree from the most prestigious institutions of higher education in this country, but are not able to fully contribute to the country. So what does that mean for mental health professionals? Well, first of all, I think an important step is having sort of these kinds of meetings where you learn and where mental health professionals can learn about sort of this topic, and learn about its full complexity beyond sort of the national rhetoric about, illegal or legal. So that when you're providing services to students, and that is an important tool in being able to support students and knowing what's available to them and how to provide encouragement and sort of help them deal with a lot of these feelings that they have. And so, I've had the privilege to talk to several colleges and universities, particularly to their mental health services, to tell them that, it's important to have somebody on staff that can help students in that way. Of course, I think there's a variety of different ways to become involved in supporting young adults, aside from sort of direct provision of services. I think there's also an opportunity as professionals to advocate on behalf of these young adults, to engage and participate in the national conversation about immigration reform, to sort of insert your experiences as professionals and your observations, to bring that perspective so that we get away from sort of this overly simplistic, and that I think in the long term is detrimental to finding a solution, because your perspectives would matter tremendously. I mean, you're the folks that you have that ability to make that impression. And so I hope that this information is useful to you, not only in providing services, but also in sharing this information with colleagues and community members, so that we can continue to work together to improve the lives of all children and young adults. If you are interested in any kind of information on these resources, I've, because of demand from various groups that I've talked to, I've archived a lot of this work on the website. And so you see there's a Twitter, there's a YouTube, there's a Facebook. If you want to find out more, there's lots of information on scholarships, for example. There's now a pretty significant number of private scholarships for which undocumented students are eligible for. So that's something that a lot of students might ask you about. Financial concerns has been identified as one of the biggest stressors. And so that information is available there for you as well. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. Yes, sir.
Did you ever interview any of the migrant workers, say the ones that are in the street corners looking for jobs? Did you ever interview any of them?
You mean the adult migrant workers? We haven't. I am particularly, my expertise is in children and young adults, and so as a developmental psychologist, my work focuses primarily on that. There's a big body of research. There's a researcher at UCLA by the name of Abel Valenzuela Jr., who's done a lot of work with day laborers, for example, and he has done all kinds of amazing work. I don't really, I haven't really, sort of studied that population, and so from that perspective, I can't speak to the challenges that they face. I mean, Professor Valenzuela's work certainly highlights that one of the big parts of their experiences for day laborers and even agricultural workers is sort of this concern about raids and also workplace exploitation, where many of them, for example, will negotiate a job, and at the end of the day they don't get paid, or they get paid less of what they were promised, and so that's something that has been documented by a lot of his work, and he's also now increasingly doing some work with maids and female service workers who work as nannies and things like that. Many of them are young adults actually. They're in their 20s and things like that. And so there's a researcher at USC by the name of Perez who has done a lot of work on that area as well. Yeah. Yes. It had a significant impact, but I think one of the I think impressive findings was that they could clearly identify the moment when those things had an impact on their schooling experience. They said, when I found out I was undocumented, my grades dropped, I started doing bad things, and I started ditching school and doing all of these things, sort of these negative social behaviors. But one of the things that they also highlighted was that and that might have gone on for several months or even over a year or 2 years. I remember talking to a young woman who, for 2 years, she pretty much just checked out because she thought, what's the point? There's nothing in it in the future, so why even try? But somewhere along that way, I mean, the reason why that story has a happy ending is because there was an educator who said, I can't let that happen to you. And another major stressor or sort of this negative impact was the sense of resentment toward their parents. Like a lot of them, they blame their parents, and when they found out it's your fault, and that really created a rift between the child and the parent, because the parent thought that they were doing what was best by protecting them. But in fact, it probably would have been better to just sort of ease them into it and let them know earlier, as opposed to at that critical juncture where they thought they were going to go to college, and all of a sudden that just completely disappears from their horizon. And so similarly, they had those sort of this stretch where they just checked out, and many of them did things that young adults shouldn't be doing because that's the only way that they knew how to cope with it. But unfortunately, we're now in the beginning stages of another study where we're actually looking to include young adults who dropped out of high school or who were not even able to continue on to higher education. We really didn't get a chance to speak to a lot of those folks. One of the reasons is that they're even harder to locate. But we don't have a good sense of what it's like for them. But what I would venture to say is that what makes the difference between those that go on to college and those that don't is that those folks that dropped out or didn't go to college didn't have somebody that intervened on their behalf, an educator or a community member, to say, no, we can't let that happen. Anecdotally, that's something that has been shared from students that have friends who are like that, but we don't have good data on that yet. Yeah, I mean, where there's this sort of growing concern and a serious concern about, what has been now known, sort of called the Latino male educational crisis, and this is something that is not just true for Latinos, it's true particularly for African American youth, but also even among white youth. If you look at college going rates, I mean, there's more young women going to college. The disparity is much higher with ethnic minority groups, particularly Latino and African Americans. But the disparity is also there with even with Caucasian young adults. And so this is a concern, particularly for the Latino immigrant community, because if you look at there are all these challenges that they face that in many ways have been found to be correlated to Latino males not going on to higher education or not performing as well as their female counterparts. But for undocumented young adult males, there's sort of that additional layer. And so whereas for the Latino population, about 63% of those that are in college are female, right? It's sort of somewhere in that range. In this sample, the rate, most of these respondents were young women. In fact, there were very few young men. And I would say that it was probably closer to like 74% that were young women. So clearly here it says that you add that extra layer of being undocumented to young Latino males, and that decreases even further their college going rates. So if we're going to tackle that issue, we have to also engage the issue of undocumented status, right? Yes, sir. Well, this is a question, thank you for asking that. It's a question that comes up a lot, and I think the trend here is, the DREAM Act holds a lot of promise because even from its introduction, some of the main sponsors of that were Republican senators who very much, were even advocates at some point. There's been a shift in sort of that discourse over the years, but it's a piece of legislation that, despite it coming 5 votes short in the Senate, there's still a lot of bipartisan support for the bill. I mean, just 2 days ago, for example, 22 senators sent a letter to President Obama. I don't know if any of you saw this on the news. 22 senators, about half of them were Republican, sent a letter to President Obama asking him to issue an executive order to halt the deportation of DREAM Act eligible young adults. So basically what that would mean is, with this executive order, undocumented young adults like the young woman you just described would not be in jeopardy of being deported, and in fact would be able to stay in the country when the DREAM Act eventually comes to pass, whether that's 2 years from now or 5 years from now or whenever that may be. I think the combination of the continuing bipartisan support, even though now that support is maybe not as balanced as it has been in the past, it continues to enjoy broad bipartisan support, and it's something that it has come very close, much closer to passing into law as compared to comprehensive immigration reform, which hasn't even come close to where the DREAM Act has been. I think you take those two things into account. You take into account the growing number of private colleges and universities that are providing full tuition assistance, a growing number now of colleges that are providing even assistance for those that want to go and get graduate degrees. I've interviewed several students that were in master's programs and PhD programs and even JD programs, that I would advise that student to explore those options, because there are things in the pipeline that maybe not the DREAM Act right away, but some short-term measures that will ensure that when she completes her university studies, that there'll be a legislation down the road and that she's not going to be in danger of deportation because of sort of the kinds of things that are happening in Congress. And so that news two days ago about sort of this letter that was sent by 22 senators, I think is encouraging, that even despite sort of the heated controversy around the issue, that the bipartisan support remains. Okay. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.